I crossed the wire, knowing the rules would not bend for me. The system saw only markings and procedure, not intent. When my own guns found me in the sky, I understood what doctrine protects and what it cannot. I landed alive, but the margin between order and loss stayed with me. In the spring of 1942, the air war over Western Europe had entered a phase of sustained pressure rather than decisive advantage. The United States Army Air Forces had begun limited operations alongside the Royal Air Force, committing small numbers of bomber and fighter units to daylight missions that tested doctrine, equipment, and coordination. Losses were accepted as the cost of learning. For air crews shot down over occupied territory, survival depended less on aerial skill than on endurance, discipline, and chance. One such air crewman was First Lieutenant William R. Ashe, a pursuit pilot assigned to the 8th Air Force. In April 1942, during one of the earliest American fighter operations over France, Ashe was forced down after his aircraft sustained damage. He survived the landing and was taken into German custody within hours. From the moment of capture, his status shifted from active combatant to prisoner of war, subject to the routines and restrictions of the Luftwaffe's prisoner system. Ashe was eventually transferred to Stalag Luft III, a newly constructed camp near the town of Sagan in Lower Silesia, then part of Germany. The camp was designed specifically for Allied air officers. It was administered by the Luftwaffe rather than the Army, and its regulations reflected a professional assumption that captured aviators would remain orderly, cooperative, and focused on survival rather than disruption. The camp itself sat on sandy soil surrounded by pine forest, deliberately chosen to make tunneling difficult. Barbed wire fences, guard towers, and controlled movement defined daily life. By mid-1942, Stalag Luft III had not yet acquired the reputation it would later earn. Its routines were still forming. Prisoners were counted multiple times a day, marched between barracks under supervision, and given limited access to exercise areas. Food was scarce but supplemented by Red Cross parcels when available. Medical care existed but was constrained. For officers like Ashe, the monotony was constant, broken only by news filtered through guards, rumors from newly arrived prisoners, or distant aircraft engines passing overhead. Ashe was not initially distinguished among the prisoners by rank or position. He was a junior officer, one of many. He observed camp routines closely, noting guard schedules, noting which sentries were rigid and which were inattentive. He listened more than he spoke. Like most captured airmen, he understood that escape was an obligation under the laws of war, but also that any attempt carried risks not only for the individual, but for fellow prisoners who might face reprisals. The operational environment surrounding the camp shaped those risks. Sagan lay within reach of multiple Luftwaffe airfields. Training units, replacement squadrons, and ferry flights moved through the region regularly. Prisoners could hear aircraft taking off and landing throughout the day. Sometimes, from work details or exercise areas, they could glimpse aircraft silhouettes above the trees. These were not front-line formations, but they were operational machines, maintained and fueled, flown by instructors or pilots rotating between assignments. For most prisoners, the presence of nearby airfields was a distant irritation rather than an opportunity. Escape plans typically focused on tunnels, forged papers, and movement by rail or on foot toward neutral borders. Aircraft theft was considered not a viable option. The technical challenges were obvious: access, fuel, navigation, and the certainty of detection. Even if an aircraft could be started and flown, recognition by friendly forces was unlikely. A lone German fighter crossing Allied lines would be treated as hostile. Ashe nevertheless paid attention to details others dismissed. He noted the types of aircraft audible from the camp. He recognized engine tones and propeller rhythms from memory. He observed weather patterns and prevailing winds. These were habits formed during flight training, carried over into captivity without conscious intent.
Over time, they became part of how he measured the world beyond the wire. The camp's early months exposed structural limitations in German security. Guards were trained to manage prisoners, not to anticipate unconventional escape methods. The assumption was that Allied officers would attempt tunneling or blending into civilian traffic, not direct seizure of military equipment. Airfields were guarded against sabotage and espionage, but not with the expectation that prisoners from a nearby camp would attempt access. At the same time, German doctrine emphasized procedural compliance over adaptability. Security routines were standardized. Aircraft parked on dispersal fields followed established patterns. Ground crews focused on maintenance tasks, often working under time pressure with minimal supervision beyond their immediate chain. Identification checks existed, but relied on uniform appearance and confidence rather than verification. Within the camp, Ash's position gave him limited but useful exposure. As an officer, he was occasionally assigned to internal administrative duties. These allowed movement between barracks and contact with prisoners from other compounds. Through these interactions, he learned which individuals had prior experience with German aircraft types, which spoke some German, and which had observed airfield layouts during earlier transfers. None of this amounted to an escape plan. At this stage, Ash did not possess the means or authorization to attempt anything beyond observation. Escape committees within the camp focused on more conventional methods. Resources were scarce. Forgery materials were prioritized for those judged most likely to succeed. Ash remained on the periphery, contributing information when asked, but not directing efforts. The operational problem was not a single obstacle, but a convergence of constraints. The camp was secure enough to prevent casual escape, but not impenetrable. The surrounding territory was heavily controlled, but also busy with military traffic. Airfields were guarded, but their routines were predictable. Any successful escape would require exploiting a gap created not by negligence, but by assumption. As weeks passed, Ash began to recognize a pattern in German movements outside the camp. Certain days brought increased flight activity, others were quiet. Training flights followed regular schedules. Fuel deliveries arrived at consistent intervals. These were not secrets, but they were not concealed either. The Germans did not consider the prisoners capable of acting on such information. The first indications of systemic limitation appeared in small incidents. Guards failed to challenge prisoners who moved with apparent purpose. Administrative paperwork lagged behind actual head counts. Minor breaches were corrected without investigation. Each correction reinforced the belief that the system worked, even as it revealed its rigidity. By early summer, Ash's captivity had settled into routine. He attended roll calls, shared meals, and participated in physical exercise. He listened to lectures organized by prisoners to maintain morale and professional development. Outwardly, nothing distinguished his conduct from that of others. Inwardly, he continued to assess possibilities without committing to action. The natural pause came not from a decision, but from accumulation. Information gathered without immediate use, observations noted without conclusion. The environment around Stalag Luft III continued to function as designed, unaware that its assumptions were being tested quietly by those it held.
By mid-1942, the routines at Stalag Luft III had hardened into predictable cycles. Guards changed shifts at fixed intervals. Work details moved along established paths. Prisoners learned which sentries enforced regulations strictly and which relied on habit. This predictability was not the result of carelessness, but of administrative confidence. The camp had been built to a plan, and its operation followed that plan with minimal deviation. Outside the wire, the operational tempo of the Luftwaffe continued despite mounting pressures on the Eastern Front and increasing Allied activity in the West. Training units remained active. Replacement pilots were cycled through familiarization flights. Aircraft transited between airfields for maintenance and reassignment. The region around Sagan was not a combat zone, but it was firmly embedded within the German air system. Ash's attention gradually shifted from the camp itself to the patterns beyond it. He observed that certain Luftwaffe aircraft types appeared repeatedly. Single-engine fighters, often flown solo or in pairs, conducted short flights that began and ended within a limited radius. These were not patrols. They were training or ferry movements, executed according to timetable rather than tactical need. Within the prisoner population, escape planning continued along orthodox lines. Tunneling committees mapped soil conditions and calculated timber requirements. Forgery teams experimented with paper substitutes and improvised inks. Language instruction was organized for those selected to attempt overland movement. The assumption underpinning these efforts was that escape, if it succeeded, would be slow and incremental, relying on anonymity and endurance. Repeated failures reinforced that assumption. Several tunneling attempts were detected before completion. One escapee was recaptured within days after attempting to pass as a civilian laborer. Each failure resulted in tighter inspections, additional roll calls, or temporary restrictions on movement. None of these measures altered the fundamental structure of the camp, but they increased caution among the prisoners. Ash observed these developments without discouragement, but with recalibration. Each failure clarified the limits of conventional approaches. Tunnels required time the prisoners did not control. Civilian disguises were compromised by accent, posture, or documentation errors. Rail travel depended on navigating a network designed for surveillance. The problem was not courage or intent, it was alignment between method and environment. At the same time, Ash became aware of a recurring contradiction in German procedure. The Luftwaffe emphasized strict control of air crew and aircraft, yet relied heavily on visible symbols of authority, uniforms, insignia, confident behavior, rather than verification. This was consistent with a hierarchical culture in which questioning a presumed superior was discouraged. Ground personnel were trained to obey recognized markers, not to investigate anomalies. The first indication that this contradiction could be exploited came indirectly. During a camp transfer for medical inspection, Ash passed near a Luftwaffe administrative area. He noted the proximity of parked aircraft to lightly supervised zones. Guards were positioned to control access roads, but dispersal areas extended beyond immediate oversight. Aircraft were often left unattended between flights, their security assumed rather than enforced. This observation did not translate immediately into action. The distance between a guarded camp and an operational airfield remained substantial. Movement between them would require leaving the camp undetected, traversing controlled territory, and entering a military installation without authorization. Each step carried independent risk, and failure at any point would likely result in severe consequences. The escalation of the problem came not from a single incident, but from the accumulation of constraints. Conventional escape routes were increasingly monitored. Resources within the camp were finite. German countermeasures adapted slowly but steadily to known methods. The gap between what prisoners were expected to attempt and what they might actually attempt remained unexamined by camp authorities. Ash's growing awareness was mirrored by a sense of limitation. As a prisoner officer, he lacked formal authority to redirect escape planning. Decisions were made by committees operating under established doctrine derived from earlier conflicts. Novel approaches were viewed skeptically, not dismissed outright, but postponed in favor of proven methods. The cost of failure was shared by all, and caution prevailed. Nevertheless, Ash began to discuss observations quietly with a small number of trusted individuals. These conversations were careful and hypothetical. He spoke of airfield routines, of aircraft types that required minimal preparation for flight, of the visibility of authority symbols. He did not propose action, he presented information and allowed others to draw conclusions. Reactions were mixed. Some dismissed the idea as impractical, citing navigation challenges and the certainty of interception by German or Allied forces. Others acknowledged the logic but questioned feasibility. No one suggested immediate pursuit. The concept existed at the margins of planning, neither adopted nor rejected. Meanwhile, German confidence remained intact. Guards continued to operate on schedule. Airfield personnel followed established routines. There was no indication that prisoners were suspected of unconventional intentions. The system functioned as designed, correcting known deviations while leaving unexamined assumptions untouched.
The growing tension lay not between individuals, but between reality and doctrine. German procedures were optimized to counter expected threats. Allied escape doctrine emphasized methods proven in earlier wars. Between these frameworks existed a narrow space where neither side anticipated the other's actions fully. Ash's position within that space became more defined as time passed. He did not yet possess a plan, but he had identified a discrepancy between capability and expectation. The challenge was not technical alone, it was institutional. Acting on that discrepancy would require stepping outside established patterns on both sides of the wire. By late summer, the camp entered another period of tightened security following a detected tunnel. Movement was restricted, searches increased, escape planning slowed. For many prisoners, this was a setback. For Ash, it was confirmation that conventional methods would continue to encounter diminishing returns. The situation had escalated to a point where observation alone no longer resolved the tension. Information without application reached its limit. The environment remained stable, but the window for action, if it existed, would depend on timing rather than preparation alone. At this stage, no decision had been made, no attempt had been authorized. The system on both sides continued to operate under familiar assumptions, unaware that those assumptions were nearing their point of failure.
By early October 1942, the balance between observation and action shifted. The change did not originate from a dramatic event, but from a narrowing of options. Conventional escape efforts within Stalag Luft III had slowed under increased scrutiny. Materials were scarce, and German countermeasures had become more systematic. The environment that once allowed incremental experimentation now favored stagnation. Ash's assessment of the situation matured into a realization that waiting for consensus would likely produce no outcome at all. The escape doctrine adhered to by the camp's senior officers was rational, but it was also bound by precedent. It assumed that future success would resemble past success. Ash's observations suggested otherwise. The surrounding operational environment, busy airfields, routine movements, procedural confidence, presented an opportunity that doctrine did not address. The turning point came when Ash concluded that the risk of inaction had become comparable to the risk of acting alone. This was not a rejection of collective responsibility, but an acknowledgement of personal agency within the laws of war. As an officer, he was obligated to attempt escape if feasible. Feasibility, in this case, depended less on approval than on timing and execution. Ash did not announce his intention. He did not seek formal endorsement. He prepared quietly, focusing on elements he could control. Language was one such element. He refined his German, concentrating on functional phrases rather than fluency. He practiced confident delivery, understanding that authority often depended on tone rather than accuracy. Clothing was another consideration. German uniforms were unobtainable, but partial adaptation was possible. Ash identified items that could pass casual inspection at a distance: a flight jacket resembling Luftwaffe issue, boots similar in cut to German patterns, and a cap that obscured hairline and expression. None of this would withstand close scrutiny, but it might suffice long enough to move through transitional spaces. Navigation presented a different challenge. Ash relied on memory rather than instruments. He studied maps when available and committed general bearings to mind. He understood that once airborne, precise navigation would be secondary to avoiding immediate interception. His objective would be to cross the front lines and reach Allied-controlled territory, not to land at a specific airfield. The aircraft itself remained the most significant variable. Ash's observations indicated that Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters were present at nearby airfields. He had encountered similar aircraft in combat and understood their basic operation. Starting procedures, throttle response, and takeoff characteristics were familiar enough to attempt flight without extended preparation. The margin for error would be small, but not non-existent.
The decision to act became personal when Ash recognized that the opportunity would not persist indefinitely. Training units rotated, aircraft were reassigned, security measures adapted incrementally. The window created by routine and assumption could close without notice. Waiting for ideal conditions would likely mean waiting indefinitely. On the morning of 4th October 1942, Ash executed his plan without ceremony. He escaped from Stalag Luft III using methods that were not novel but were effective. Timing his movement to coincide with routine activities, exploiting moments of reduced oversight, and moving with purpose rather than concealment. His escape from Stalag Luft III did not involve confrontation. It relied on the same procedural predictability that governed daily life. Once outside the camp, Ash moved toward a nearby Luftwaffe airfield at Sagan. The distance was manageable, but the terrain was controlled. He avoided roads when possible, using tree lines and minor paths. His pace was deliberate. He understood that haste could attract attention as readily as hesitation. At the airfield perimeter, Ash encountered the first test of his assumption about authority. He did not attempt to hide. Instead, he approached as though he belonged. His posture was upright. His movement was direct. When challenged by ground personnel, he responded in German with brief, confident phrases. He did not explain his presence, he implied it. The airfield's routines worked in his favor. Ground crews were accustomed to pilots arriving on foot, sometimes without escort. Documentation was not routinely checked. The expectation was that unauthorized individuals would not present themselves openly. Ash's behavior aligned with that expectation. He selected a Bf-109 that appeared flight-ready. The aircraft was fueled and positioned for use. No guard was stationed nearby. Ash climbed into the cockpit and began the startup sequence. Each action was performed with the awareness that hesitation could invite scrutiny. The engine responded as expected. No alarm was raised. Taxiing to the runway represented another moment of risk. Ash followed standard procedures, signaling when necessary, and maintaining alignment with ground operations. His movements did not disrupt routine, they blended into it. The aircraft was cleared for takeoff without extended communication. Once airborne, Ash confronted the limits of his plan. The Bf-109's controls were familiar but unforgiving. He maintained altitude and course while scanning for interceptors. The aircraft bore German markings, offering temporary protection from German anti-aircraft fire, but increasing the risk of engagement by Allied forces once he crossed the front. The flight itself was brief but intense. Ash navigated by terrain features and general direction, avoiding known concentrations of flak when possible. He did not engage in evasive maneuvers beyond maintaining speed and altitude. His objective was not stealth, but transition, moving from one controlled airspace to another before either side fully reacted. As he approached Allied lines, the risk shifted. The German aircraft was now an anomaly. Allied units were trained to engage such targets without hesitation. Ash attempted to signal his intent through wing movements and by maintaining a non-threatening profile, but recognition was uncertain. The distinction between enemy and friendly depended on markings, not intention. The risk became immediate when Allied anti-aircraft units opened fire. Ash's aircraft sustained damage, but he maintained control. He continued toward the coast, seeking a location to land before further engagement. His margin for error narrowed with each passing second. Eventually, Ash reached the English Channel and located a stretch of coastline suitable for landing. He brought the aircraft down under fire, sustaining further damage but avoiding catastrophic failure. Upon landing, he exited the aircraft quickly, signaling surrender to approaching Allied personnel. The reception was cautious. Ash was detained until his identity could be verified. His account was met with skepticism, then confirmation. The aircraft was secured.
Ash was returned to Allied control, his escape complete but not yet fully understood within institutional frameworks. The turning point had passed. An unofficial decision made without authorization or precedent had carried Ash from captivity to freedom. The risk became personal and immediate, borne by a single individual rather than a committee. The consequences of that decision, however, were only beginning to emerge.
Ash's return to Allied control did not conclude the episode. It initiated a different phase shaped by institutional response and operational consequence. In the days following his landing, Ash was transported through a sequence of holding points, each governed by procedure rather than curiosity. Initial debriefings focused narrowly on verification, identity, unit, circumstances of capture, and method of return. His account was recorded, cross-checked against missing personnel lists, and compared with intelligence reports of a German aircraft loss. The reaction was restrained. Ash was not treated as a hero, nor as a liability. He was an anomaly. The Allied system was designed to process pilots returning from combat missions, not prisoners who arrived in enemy aircraft. There was no established category for such cases. As a result, responsibility for interpreting his actions shifted between intelligence officers, operational commanders, and administrative staff. From an intelligence perspective, the aircraft itself was of immediate interest. The Bf-109 was examined by technical teams, its condition documented, its instruments inspected. Ash was questioned about its configuration, performance, and any observations he could provide regarding Luftwaffe procedures. His answers were factual and limited to what he had directly experienced. He did not speculate beyond his knowledge. Operational commanders, however, viewed the incident through a different lens. The most immediate concern was the risk posed during Ash's approach to Allied lines. Anti-aircraft units had engaged the aircraft as trained. Friendly fighters had been alerted. That Ash had not been shot down was due more to circumstance than recognition. The system had functioned correctly according to doctrine, even if the outcome was unusual. This raised an uncomfortable issue. If Ash's aircraft had been destroyed, the loss would have been attributed to standard defensive action. There would have been no mechanism to account for intent. The incident exposed a limitation inherent in identification-based engagement rules. That limitation was acknowledged internally, but not addressed formally. Adjusting doctrine to account for rare anomalies risked creating dangerous ambiguity in routine operations. Ash's chain of command faced a parallel dilemma. His escape had not been authorized. It had bypassed established escape committees and violated the implicit expectation that prisoners would act collectively. Yet the laws of war recognized escape attempts as legitimate. Ash had not endangered fellow prisoners, nor had his actions prompted reprisals. From a legal standpoint, his conduct was defensible. Nevertheless, institutional culture favored order and predictability. Ash's initiative challenged both. He had exploited procedural assumptions on the German side and navigated through Allied defenses without coordination. While the result was successful, the method was not replicable at scale. Encouraging similar actions could increase friendly fire incidents without guaranteeing returns. As a result, Ash's case was handled quietly. He was not publicly commended. He was not reprimanded. His experience was documented in reports circulated among a limited audience. Lessons were noted rather than codified. The system absorbed the incident without visibly changing its contours. Within the prisoner of war community, Ash's escape became known gradually. News traveled through informal channels, often distorted by retelling. For those still in captivity, the story represented proof of possibility rather than a model to follow. Few possessed the combination of opportunity, skill, and circumstance required to attempt such an escape. Camp authorities did not alter security procedures in response, suggesting that the Germans either did not fully grasp the method or judged it too improbable to address. Ash himself returned to duty after a period of rest and evaluation. He did not seek publicity. His subsequent assignments were unremarkable in administrative terms. He flew operational missions and continued his service without reference to his escape in official summaries. The episode remained an outlier, acknowledged but not emphasized. The broader stakes of Ash's action lay not in its immediate tactical value, but in what it revealed about institutional systems under stress. Both sides had operated according to doctrine optimized for typical conditions. Ash's escape succeeded by aligning with those doctrines rather than confronting them. He had moved through the spaces between rules, where verification gave way to assumption. The peak of the episode was not the flight itself, but the moment when Allied fire engaged an aircraft piloted by one of their own. That moment underscored the limits of identification, communication, and expectation in a high-tempo environment. It was a reminder that systems designed for clarity can produce risk when confronted with ambiguity. Ash did not advocate for doctrinal change. He did not argue that his method should be adopted. His role in the aftermath was passive, providing information when asked and returning to duty when cleared. The system, for its part, acknowledged the incident without elevating it into a precedent. By the time Ash resumed regular operations, the war had moved on. Larger formations filled the skies. Losses increased. Individual anomalies were subsumed by scale. The institutional response to Ash's escape settled into archival record rather than operational guidance. The consequences of his actions had been absorbed. The question of legacy remained unresolved, deferred not by controversy, but by indifference to singular cases amid mass conflict.
By the time William R. Ash returned to routine flying duties, the incident of his escape had already receded from immediate operational concern. The war's scale ensured that individual cases, however unusual, were quickly overtaken by new demands. Bomber formations expanded, escort requirements intensified, and losses mounted on both sides. In this environment, Ash's experience was filed, referenced, and then set aside. Formally, the U.S. Army Air Forces concluded its internal review without issuing new directives. No procedural amendments were made regarding identification of enemy aircraft approaching Allied lines. Anti-aircraft units were neither criticized nor retrained as a result of the incident. The existing doctrine, engage hostile marked aircraft unless positively identified otherwise, remained unchanged. It was judged essential for survival in a contested airspace where hesitation could be fatal. Ash's escape was therefore categorized as an exception rather than a lesson. Intelligence summaries noted the vulnerability created by predictable Luftwaffe routines and the reliance on visible authority symbols, but these observations did not translate into actionable policy. They reinforced existing assessments about German procedural rigidity without altering Allied assumptions about escape feasibility. On the German side, the response was similarly muted. Luftwaffe records acknowledged the loss of an aircraft under unusual circumstances, but no widespread security overhaul followed. Airfields continued to operate under the same assumptions about access and authority. Prisoner of war camps were not significantly redesigned in response. The incident did not fit neatly into German counterintelligence frameworks, and its singular nature reduced its perceived relevance. Within Stalag Luft III, life continued much as before. The camp would later become known for large-scale escape efforts involving extensive tunneling operations, but at the time of Ash's departure, those events lay in the future. His escape did not become a catalyst for change among the prisoners. It was remembered as a rare convergence of opportunity and individual initiative, not as a reproducible method. Ash himself did not leverage his experience for advancement. His service record after the escape reflects a return to conventional duties. He flew missions, followed orders, and operated within established command structures. There is no indication that he sought recognition or used the episode to influence planning or doctrine. In official narratives of the air war, his name appeared infrequently, if at all. The absence of formal recognition was not punitive. It reflected the institutional preference for collective achievement over individual deviation. The air war was understood as a system of coordinated effort, where outcomes depended on formations, logistics, and sustained pressure rather than singular acts. Ash's escape, while successful, did not alter that calculus. In later years, as wartime records were reviewed and personal accounts surfaced, Ash's story attracted retrospective attention. Historians and researchers noted the improbability of the event and its implications for understanding procedural vulnerability. Yet even in hindsight, the episode resisted simplification. It was neither a failure of German security alone, nor a triumph of Allied ingenuity in the conventional sense. It was a case study in how systems function until they encounter conditions they were not designed to address. Ash's legacy remained quiet. He did not publish memoirs centered on the escape. He did not tour as a speaker recounting the event. When referenced, his actions were described plainly, without embellishment. The facts were sufficient. An American pilot, held as a prisoner of war, identified an unguarded assumption, acted within the limits of his training, and returned to friendly control through means neither anticipated nor repeated. The broader significance of the episode lies in its restraint. It illustrates how wartime systems absorb anomalies without necessarily adapting to them, prioritizing reliability over flexibility. It also underscores the narrow margin between success and loss in environments governed by identification rather than intent. Ash survived not because the system recognized him, but because it functioned consistently on both sides of the line he crossed. In the years following the war, the airfields near Sagan fell silent, the camp was abandoned, and borders shifted. The routines that made Ash's escape possible ceased to exist. What remained were records, memories, and a single aircraft theft that briefly intersected with two opposing systems without altering either. For viewers interested in understanding the war beyond its major operations and celebrated figures, stories like Ash's offer a different perspective. They reveal how individual judgment operates within rigid structures, and how outcomes can hinge on assumptions rarely examined. These are not stories of decisive impact, but of lived experience within vast institutions.